Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, conservationists around the world are urging China to apply a permanent ban on the wildlife trade following the coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan. Chinese scientists believe the virus there originated in wildlife sold illegally in a live animal market. China has temporarily banned the sale of wildlife in markets, restaurants and e-commerce platforms. Correspondents say the wildlife markets in China are unique because of the number of wildlife species that are brought together there. They say that up to 40 wildlife species can be found in such markets mixed together, often with domestic species. Well, in a moment, we'll speak to one of the global conservationists calling for the ban on the wildlife trade, the Director General of the Nigerian Conservation Foundation, Dr. Mutari Aminu Kano. But first, here's an expert talking about this trade.
These exist because people like to eat exotic meats, and because they think they have special medical properties. They don't. They're just risks not only for China, but for the whole world. 70% of emerging infectious diseases, everything from AIDS to Zika, comes in some way or another out of wildlife. All the evidence that we've seen thus far indicates that this virus came from wildlife. There may have been some intermediate domestic animal, we don't know yet, but it then moved from wildlife into people. It is now spreading person to person very efficiently, and there is no evidence that there was any conspiracy or sloppiness or anything that led to anything coming out of the Institute for Virology in Wuhan.
Well, for more on this, I'm joined now from our Lagos studios by the Director General of the Nigerian Conservation Foundation, Dr. Mutari Aminu Kano. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Aminu Kano, for joining us. I know you're busy, so we appreciate your presence today. And part of the issue with these wildlife markets is the range of wildlife species, isn't it? From civets to snakes, tortoises, porcupines, rats, wild birds, really huge diversity in this unique space. And each of these species have their own package of viruses which they harbor naturally.
Yeah, absolutely right, Charles. First of all, it's great to be with you, and thanks for having me and giving us this opportunity. Each particular group of wildlife or animals have their own organisms that live with and within them, which are potentially dangerous germs that are within those things. But when you add different groups and different categories and different types of animals in the same place, especially where in these wet markets, as they call them in China, where they are secreting bodily fluids like their feces, urine, blood, and other things are all mixed together, then there is a chance of one germ moving from one species to the other, and from there spilling over into human beings.
Of course, the danger as well is the fact that a lot of these animals have their own natural immunity to those viruses, but the other animals may not, and that's where the real problem comes, doesn't it?
Yes. Wildlife in general, they are a reservoir of potential health problems, but when they are living in the wild and away from contact with human beings, the chances of any spillover into human beings is very little. And as you know, just like with weeds on your farm, grasses that come to overwhelm your crops, when weeds meet a field that is freshly cultivated and there are no history of weeds, that is when they do best. So the wildlife living within their forests, scattered with not much contact with human beings, are safe and okay, and the germs or bacteria or viruses within them are not doing them much harm. Just like we human beings have a lot of microorganisms within us that are not doing us any harm. It is when something happens to break the balance, or when we meet others that are less immune, are more vulnerable than us, that's when the trouble comes. And that's what is happening in those markets, that different types of animals are brought from different places to mix with each other, and then mix with domestic livestock and mix with human beings. So the contact is the most important thing of different types of animals, different types of bodily fluids from those animals, and then the proximity to human contact.
So basically what you have is a multitude of species which either never meet or very rarely meet. You capture them, you stress them out, you shift them across the country, across the globe in some cases, which basically wipes out their immune system and causes large amounts of viruses to be shed. And they're all together in a very tight space, often stacked together on top of each other. So a cauldron, if you like, of contagion, the perfect laboratory, which is sort of an ideal breeding ground for new viruses.
Yeah, I like the way you put it, the perfect laboratory, because even as human beings, we know that when we are stressed, we are more vulnerable to exhibiting illnesses, and then we now are able to share whatever illness we've got. And that's exactly it. So the stress in terms of the capture of this wildlife, their transportation to the final destination, and then stacking them up and squashing them into this stressful environment is what makes them even more vulnerable to those diseases, which are then caught by other animals. And normally it jumps from one type of wildlife to another, or one group of wildlife to domestic animals, and then to human beings. And just like the expert in your introductory clip said, it is when then things start moving between human beings, so that the transmission is between human to human, that it turns into a pandemic.
Right. So, I mean, in a sense, it is a numbers game, isn't it? I mean, if you keep doing this with these wildlife markets, at some stage you'll get a virus which will spill over and be able to enter a human cell, reproduce, and on some occasions be able to transmit from human to human, which is essentially, to put it sort of, mildly, what you've got with the coronavirus.
Yeah, it is an irresistible force meeting an immovable object. So it's just a matter of time. Something must give, as long as you have these markets where this thing is happening. But just as much as it is a numbers game, it's also a space game. So even in the wild now, because we are damaging so many wild areas in the world, we are concentrating wildlife into ever decreasing and smaller areas. And as you know, where you have concentration of individuals is where diseases get transmitted. For example, even among human beings, you get outbreaks more in cities than in outskirts and villages. So it's the same thing with wildlife. The more you concentrate them on a smaller space, the more you increase the chances of widespread of diseases. And in those markets in particular, it is just an accident waiting to, in fact, it's not even an accident, it's a certainty waiting to happen just for its time. When you have those conditions, we all know that's where the next big outbreak of a global pandemic is coming.
So, Dr. Aminu Kano, since the outbreak, this latest sort of coronavirus outbreak, China has temporarily banned the sale of wildlife in not just markets, but in restaurants and other places too. Is it your sense that that goes far enough, or should the ban be permanent?
What we are calling in the conservation community and even in the health community is that that doesn't go far enough. That might be sufficient for now temporarily, but unless you put a permanent ban, it's not going to solve the issue. Because we've been here before. In 2002, we had a similar pandemic. People can remember SARS, which created so much so much panic around the world and so on. And China put a temporary ban on this same thing they have done. But after the crisis or the emergency phase of that disease was over, then the ban was relaxed, and now we are here. So that is all the more reason that tells the temporary ban doesn't work, because we don't want in another 20 years, 15 years, then we are back into the same position.
And is this call for a permanent ban, is the for a permanent ban unanimous? I mean, around the world? Because obviously you're in Africa. Africa's been very fortunate. The disease hasn't quite arrived. But other parts of the world, in Europe, you know, the Middle East, and of course in Asia, we're seeing growing numbers of cases. Are conservationists in that global community united that there ought to be a permanent ban? We've got less than a minute.
Yeah, I think most are, but most especially even within China itself, there is a growing demand for this to be a permanent ban. One point I wanted to add to this is that, look, trade in wildlife or anything is a function of supply and demand. As your expert said at the beginning of this clip, the demand is huge. It's there for this wildlife, either for medicine, for food, as a status symbol, or so on in China. So unless you really take the regulation route, there is no way you can clamp down on the trade and get us back to where we are now.
Okay, Dr. Mutari Aminu Kano, please stay with us. We want to talk with you some more. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about the call by campaigners and conservationists for a permanent ban on the wildlife trade in China as cases of the coronavirus escalate. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Eniegolu. Now, global conservationists are urging China to apply a permanent ban on the wildlife trade following the coronavirus outbreak. Markets selling live animals are considered a potential source of diseases that are new to humans. There's been speculation that such a market in Wuhan could have been the starting point for the corona outbreak. China put a temporary ban on the trade in wildlife as one measure to control the spread of COVID-19, but conservationists say it's not enough. They argue that in addition to protecting human health, a permanent ban would be a vital step in the effort to end the illegal trading of wildlife. They say that China's demand for wildlife products, which find uses in traditional medicine or as exotic foods, is driving a global trade in endangered species. More than 70% of the emerging infections in humans are estimated to have come from animals, particularly wild animals. And with me from our Lagos studios, the Director General of the Nigerian Conservation Foundation, Dr. Mutari Aminu Kano. Dr. Aminu Kano, thank you ever so much for staying with us. Do you think that a permanent ban, the sort of permanent ban that you're calling for, is likely to happen? I mean, isn't it more likely that after the outbreak is over, they'll just go back to business as usual, as more or less, as you mentioned, happened with SARS and other viruses?
Yes, I think there is a strong danger on that. So it is necessary for the global community to keep putting pressure for this ban to come in place as a permanent ban. I think all the reasons and excuses being given for making it temporary really don't hold water. China is not one of the, is the most important market for trade in illegal and legal trade in wildlife, especially animals and animal products from Africa, for the same reasons you've mentioned. And, but what gives me hope, as I mentioned just before we went on break, is the fact that even within China now, there is a groundswell of opinion that there should be this ban on the trade. And whatever reason you can say that maybe you shouldn't ban the trade, you should, because there are domestic production of wildlife in China and so on, doesn't really hold water, because we have seen really that there is this gray area between the species being traded internationally or trafficked and the ones that are coming into the market from the so-called domestic sources. So we need to really hold the feet of everyone concerned to the fire that these acts are impacting the whole of the global community. They are leading to massive losses in the economy. I've just read some of the figures coming out about the impact of this on the global economy. But most especially also, they are emptying forests, and we in Africa should be particularly concerned about the amount of plants and animals being taken out of Africa to China in terms of illegal trade, whether it is rosewood, which we have a very good example and knowledge of here in Nigeria, but to everything, including rhinos, chimpanzees, pangolins. You just hear it all the time. And Nigeria is particularly in the center of this, because we have, for some reason, now become the transit point, and in some cases, the point of origin for a lot of this wildlife being trafficked to China.
So if I am understanding you correctly, you're not just now talking about a permanent ban in China, you're also talking about it in places like Nigeria. I mean, you think that should be applied in Nigeria and the rest of Africa as well? Because there's also a lot of, beyond the fact that it's being trafficked out of the continent, there's also a lot of consumption of wildlife here.
So it is a lot more nuanced when you come to Africa and the trade and so on. I think the international trade in wildlife from Africa to other parts of the world, there is a good global mechanism for regulating it. And what we need to do is just to enforce it. And there is a case for certain species of wildlife that could benefit even from international trade and so on. So the ban really that we are calling for is the ban of wildlife for consumption in these wet markets in China. But we are also calling for stronger regulation and more scientifically based policies in trade in wildlife in general. Now, when you come to domestic consumption of something like bushmeat, there is also a case for that. As I mentioned, that especially in a place like Nigeria, where we have lost a large proportion of our domestic wildlife, really, so that most through Nigeria to China and so on is coming from as far away as the Democratic Republic of Congo, because we have emptied most of our forests and not much is coming from here. So there is a chance that even here, especially for certain species that are beyond their threshold level, we should impose a ban on whether consuming them or trading in them locally or trading in them internationally. But we wouldn't call for a blanket ban on consumption or trade of everything in Nigeria. We would rather call for a more nuanced, more science-based utilization of these species here in Nigeria, and that needs to be regulated and enforced properly. But I am one of those who think really the bushmeat trade has been a very, very negative thing for the economy of Nigeria, for the environment of Nigeria, and it's a danger also to the health of Nigerians. We've seen even locally, some of those factors playing in China are playing out here. How do you think the monkeypox issue came about, or even Lassa fever that we are now having problem with? That didn't come from China or anywhere. It's again based on this same issue about closer contact with stressed wildlife and the fact that we are still engaged seriously in this consumption, rampant consumption and trade in those species.
So, Dr. Aminu Kano, looking at sort of Nigeria, Africa, and of course China, is it more an issue of enforcement than the law itself? I mean, because a lot of the wildlife trade around the world is already illegal. I mean, it's more a question of sort of the enforcing the legislation. That is an important part, isn't it? We've got about a minute left.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's more an issue. There are maybe a few holes here and there in the framework, the legislation or regulation, but the key issue is enforcing. If we could just strongly implement existing policies and laws, then a lot of these problems wouldn't arise.
Do you see any indications at all from the authorities in China that they're willing to reassess their wildlife legislation or the legislation which regulates the trade and consumption of wildlife?
There is a move. I mean, this goes right up to the Politburo, and we know that they have started a process to review the legislation and so on. But like I said, I think we should only be cautiously optimistic because we haven't seen these radical changes that are needed happen after SARS and some of the other episodes that happened in the past.
Well, Dr. Aminu Kano, Mutari Aminu Kano, Director General of the Nigerian Conservation Foundation, very, very enlightening words and thoughts coming from you there. Thank you ever so much for being on the program. Well, that's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow from me and the entire team here in Abuja and Lagos. Bye-bye, and thank you for watching.